Welcome to the Gauntlet Podcast. My name is Kate.
My name is Jason.
My name is Andrew.
Listeners, we'd like to welcome Andrew fucking Medeiros to the show again.
Is that your actual middle name, Drew?
Yeah, I had to legally change my name to accommodate that expletive.
It's only just because of how amazing and famous and wonderful you are, Andrew. Known for such things as Urban Shadows and The Forgotten, and congratulations on your recent Kickstarter of The Watch with Anna Kreider. It's exciting.
Yes, it's very exciting.
That way.
No, it's super exciting. I'm glad that was a successful Kickstarter. Oh, man.
It's lovely. I'm very excited. And it's one of my favorite games for doing my very next question, which is, what is giving you bleed lately, friends of mine?
Okay. Giving me bleed. My last two giving me bleeds were pretty depressing. Listeners may recall. They were really, really sad. So I've got one that's like only mildly sad and a little more happy. I recently read an article, very recently, like just a couple days ago, about how like men, as they get older, especially, they stop having friendships. Does that make sense? Like they stop having like close friendships. It was like this study that was done. It was in the New York Times, this article. Anyway, I got thinking about it and I was like, gosh, that's just so sad. But I got thinking about some of the men, in my life, like my uncles and my dad and that kind of thing. And I was like, I think that's true. Like, I do think they stop having like close, like other male, like, sort of like friendships. And I was thinking about that a lot. I was thinking about a lot of like toxic masculinity stuff and like how those issues kind of intersect with like making it difficult for a lot of men to like have close affectionate friendships, right? And that kind of thing. You're a bad influence on me, Kate. And
I love everything you're saying, by the way.
I know,
Jason.
I can see it on your face. And but I got thinking about it and it was just kind of a bummer. I was like, oh gosh, what a bummer. And then that got me thinking about the Gauntlet and my own relationships. And, I was thinking like, man, one of the things I'm really happy about with the Gauntlet is, it's a quasi-public group, but, for the most part, like I'm playing games with a lot of the same people. I'm making friendships. Like it's good. Like I'm glad I have this in my life, it's like a good touchstone. And so here's the game part. Here's the bleed part. And mine's kind of cheating because it's something that happened a while ago, but it's a little apropos because we have Drew on. So, Fraser Simons and I are working on this project right now where we're trying to like pull together some of the better Gauntlet Hangouts games and make them into like listenable AP. And we're still kind of figuring out where that's going, but he dropped in a 5-minute segment into our Slack just a couple of hours ago of a game of the Woodlands that we played, which is Drew's Mouse Guard-esque PBTA game, right? And the MP3 file said the campfire scene. And I remembered the scene. I was like, oh, I remember that. Like, yeah, that was a good scene. And Fraser goes, he's like, listen to this all the way. Like, he's like, I got teary-eyed when I went back and listened to it. And I was thinking like, well, why? Like I ran that game and I don't remember it being particularly emotional. It was a good scene, but I got listening to it and I immediately figured out like why it was an emotional thing for Fraser. And because it was for me too. Like I listened to it and I got emotional. And the reason why is because the scene was just about the characters at camp. And I kind of like explicitly like kind of took the reins off and kind of just held back and said, okay, well, you guys just kind of role play this scene out. Like just do some stuff in camp, like do whatever you want to do. Like, let's just see what the characters, get up to when they're not like on the mission. Right. And it was just this like really, really like lovely, like description of how the characters were being like kind to one another, being tender to one another, how the characters were supporting each other. And all of that was kind of like also coming through in the play. Like you could tell that all the players were also like very much like kind of invested in it. And there was just such a good, like friendly rapport going on. And yeah, and I guess like, so my bleed was kind of a post bleed because we played this game like, 2 months ago, but it was a good memory to have. I'm glad that Fraser shared it. And, it's just got me really thinking about this idea of missing companionship, missing like male platonic companionship in one's life. So that's it.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really great. I like the insight into The Woodlands is a metaphor for male relationships.
Right, yeah. Or something, I don't know. Well, the funny thing is that, like, not all the characters were actually male, but, like, I think it was the combination of the characters and, like, just how us as players, the table was entirely male, like, how we were kind of just working with each other to build the scene, and it just comes through, like, really, like, the two things just kind of, like, match up so nicely. It's really great.
Excellent. Andrew, what's giving you bleed?
I just want to say I'm really glad that you had that experience, Jason. That's why I wrote The Woodlands, so that men in their 30s and 40s could reignite their friendships. No,
well, I mean, in all seriousness, though, I just love The Woodlands. I really love it. Like, I want more people to play it. I think it's so cool.
Thank you. It's just a wonderful side effect. I'm super happy to hear that. It's wonderful. So I haven't been RPing much lately. I'm in a bit of a gaming funk these days, which is kind of hilarious since I just finished a Kickstarter for an RPG. But I have recently attended Breakout Con, that you may or may not have heard of.
What's a Breakout?
What's a Breakout? It was a fantastic experience. It got me RPing again for the first time in a few months, and the first time emceeing since probably October.
Wow.
So nice it's nice to kind of put on those familiar shoes and go for a walk in it. And I ran the Watch, a long con, 3-session long con at Breakout, and it was great. And so I didn't experience bleed lately as a player, but I certainly had a moment as an MC that really stuck with me in the final session. We had a lioness who's sort of this vain and beautiful person who was living in the shadow of her sister. And she had the spear that she had inherited from her sister. Her sister was this famed warrior that everyone knew and respected, and so she was trying to live up to this legacy. And she took the spear everywhere she went. But her and a fellow watchwoman had a bit of a falling out, and due to some unfortunate shadow manipulation, trying to drive a wedge between them, and she refused to sort of speak to this person and was trying to seek solace away from this other person, and then was seeking counsel with the spider, which is always a terrible idea.
That's true, actually. My one playtest of that confirms that completely.
Absolutely. I mean, the spider could totally be a wonderful, supportive person, but it often gets played as a very weird individual who can sometimes be very hard to connect with.
Right.
But they were with them and seeking counsel, and this member of the Watch who they were at odds with entered the scene, and so the lioness decided they wanted to get some insight. So they rolled some dice, and it just sort of occurred to me that to sort of grant her that insight, indicating that until she learned to step out of the shadow of her sister and start living her life for her own purposes and trying to seek out her own goals, that these sort of wedges were going to continue, because she was trying to achieve something that wasn't her, trying to live to be someone else. And I just remember describing the scene in a really touching way. I don't remember the words, just the feelings more than anything else, where I had sort of brought to your attention, like, you need to give up trying to be your sister, and you need to be yourself again. And, until you make peace with yourself, you're not going to be able to make peace with your sisters. And she did. And she took that advice, and she apologized, and it was just this really beautiful scene that I felt pride for this character, like a parent would feel pride for their child learning and growing. So that was kind of bleedy for me.
That sounds lovely.
In a good way. Yeah, it was a lovely bleed, not a sad one this time for me, which was nice.
Did you feel pride for the lioness?
Oh, I did! Ah!
I hate it!
I love it.
Kill it with fire.
No,
this is my segment. There will be no puns.
Darn it.
Thank you for sharing that. That's great, and it also makes me really happy that happened at Breakout.
Mm-hmm.
A little pride moment there for me. Oh, what am I bleeding? So I've been playing Monsterhearts 2 a lot. Like, a lot. I'm running a game. I'm in 2 games. It just feels like, I think it's the only thing I'm actually playing right now, so it's a little overwhelming how much Monsterhearts there is in my life.
It's taking over a lot of my game time, too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Monsterhearts 2 is all over the place right now.
It is. And I joined a new group recently of people who have never played Monsterhearts before, with a GM who is experienced running it, and it's a shiny new group of people who have even just joined Toronto Area Gamers recently. So I was like, I'm going to get in on this, and I'm going to show them how to Monster Heart. And I was going to make a queen with like Jason Momoa as my face, but instead I made Immortal because everyone else was powerhouses. And I was like, oh no, I'm going to make the sad character and it's just going to happen. And I've been playing the Immortal and she's in love with the werewolf and the werewolf is like okay with her, but has a real thing for the vampire. And my Immortal does everything for the werewolf. Like she went and got his bike from a bunch of gangsters. Just to like show him that she loved him. She does all his homework. She tutors him. She just does everything she can for him. And when she was like, I love you. And he was like, oh, but I'm like totally into this other girl.
Ouch.
Wow.
Yeah. And instead of being like a normal human and being like, oh, well, that sucks. I guess I should find someone new to love. I was like, I need to be better. You don't love me because I'm not good enough for you.
Oh.
And I remember being like a teenager and having those moments where people would like dismiss you or tell you whatever you're doing wasn't quite enough. I had my father was huge into telling me what I was doing wasn't enough, and I was like, oh, I remember feeling these things. This is horrible. And I was talking with Mick, a member of the Gauntlet, and we were reflecting on it. We're like, yeah, from the outside this looks really, really toxic, but when you're in these moments, you never recognize them for what they are. And the two of us had a really good moment where we just kind of like were vulnerable and like, yeah, I do this all the time when people are like, oh, you know, that was okay in terms of like our how we feel about each other, but I don't know, we could get along better maybe if you were X, Y, or Z. So I felt like I grew up more and a little with my self-reflection.
Yeah.
in that Monsterhearts moment when I was pulling it apart later. It wasn't good.
Yeah.
That's one. Good old Monsterhearts sticking up our teenage traumas, helping us address them.
It's very good at that, yeah.
It always finds something new to poke. Our topic this week, now that we're all sad, or happy, or proud, or our assortment of emotions. Thanks everyone for sharing and being vulnerable and talking about your bleed. I know it's not the easiest thing to do. But our topic is talking about death and grief in gaming. Jason and I were sitting at Dreamation. I almost said Metatopia, but we were sitting at Dreamation, a little bit fried out Saturday night, and we were like, what should we talk about next? And immediately we were both kind of like, character death, right? People have talked about character death a lot, but I think we need to talk about like the emotionality of character death.
It's because we were dead.
It's true, we were exhausted.
I don't know. What about when the characters are just dead? How about that?
Right? What about dead things? Yeah. So we decided we would talk about death, the space in games provided for death, and if there was a lot of games that kind of dealt with that. And the reason we immediately were like, Andrew Medeiros, was because in The Watch, there's this great move where you get to say a eulogy for women who have fallen. And it's one of the only games I can think of where it actually acknowledges A, that you die and it means something, and B, provides a space for grief. So what are your thoughts on just character death? Before we get into like the grief aspect, I want to kind of break down character death.
Well, I suppose there are several different like kind of axes or dimensions which you can talk about character death, right? I mean, I'm going to suggest that probably 75% of the games that I play in, when a character dies, it's not that big of a deal, right, at the table. That's usually because we're doing something kind of adventure-y, something kind of action-oriented, a horror thing. Character death is kind of expected. It's like a thing we know is going to happen in the world, and it's usually mechanically arbitrated. And so I can't say that like too often does everyone at the table get super invested in the character in such a way that the character death feels super meaningful. Now, having said that, I have been in plenty of games where it has been, right? But I think in order for the character death to pay off, I think there has to, or to pay off, that sounds terrible. Like, and I think for the character death to have meaning, it should have really significant, like, sort of fictional meaning, in the sense of we kind of decided when the character died. Like, we chose a moment when it made sense for the character to die. I think that's an important part of it.
So, like, consensual death?
Well, you know, I guess what I'm thinking about is, like, my buddy Dan, who used to be on the podcast, we used to talk about character death a lot. One of his big kind of things he was always against as a sort of game player is this idea that in role-playing games, like role-playing games are the only sort of storytelling exercise in which we often don't have control over when the characters die. Right? Like, you know, like it's an automated thing. It's a mechanical thing. You think like D&D and hit points and things like that, right? Whereas like if you were writing a book, you wouldn't roll dice to determine when the character dies, right? You would choose the moment in the story where it made sense, right? So I think that's a component of like whether character death feels significant or not in a role-playing game is, did that character death make sense in our overall fiction? I think is what I'm getting at there. And then also I think there's something to be said for expectations. Like, do we have an expectation that these characters are going to maybe randomly die, like in a brutal OSR game? Or do we have an expectation that this is not really going to be a sort of like, where death is not really like explicitly on the table. And so when it happens, like it's really like meaningful, right? So I guess like that's like at the outset, that's where my thinking is, you know, how much does the game let us control the fiction in terms of determining when the characters are dead or when they die and how they die, and what are our expectations as players about what character death is going to be like.
See, I've always found the randomness of, I would say more trad game style death, where it's like, oh, you're at -10 hit points, you're officially dead.
Right.
Simultaneously really accurate to life, where people just die, and it doesn't always make sense. But also really harrowing in the sense that my character just watched one of their best friends die, and I'm supposed to just get over it and keep going. Like, I'm not supposed to stop fighting. I'm supposed to be like, oh, well, that sucks. Keep going. I've always found that, like, weird paradigm really, really difficult to handle in D&D. Mostly because it treats death entirely like it shouldn't mean anything.
It's transactional in D&D, right? I mean, for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Where's your 5,000 GP of diamonds and you'll come back?
I love the metaphor there. Like, if you're really rich, you get to avoid the limitations of mortality. So
It's true. What are your thoughts on character death in general, Andrew?
I love character death.
What?
I've always been absolutely obsessed with it, which is weird, I know.
Obsessed with it?
Well, I've always been very fond of it. Yeah.
Were you a TPK GM?
No, not as a GM, but as a player. I used to love when my D&D characters died. Because, for one thing, I loved making characters in D&D, so that was kind of exciting. But also just like, it really made it feel like the stakes were real, right? My character might not survive this encounter. I remember showing up to a session that was in the middle of starting up, and I had run a little bit, maybe an hour late, and I got there, no worries, we just started a fight. And then 5 minutes later, my character was dead. I literally had just made them. I was like, great.
Yeah, but did you feel anything, though?
I did not feel anything, no. That is the extreme case where it could happen randomly, but I just thought it was dramatic and kind of exciting in a way, like where we had a new kind of thing to deal with emotionally as a group, so it was kind of exciting that way. There wasn't a lot of mechanical support for it in D&D to make it a special moment, just whatever we as a group decided we wanted to invest into it. But yeah, I've always enjoyed it, and that's why I use it a lot in games, and I make sure there's some mechanical backing to it, so that no matter when you die, you as the player will have a moment specifically devoted to that character afterward, so that it has meaning.
I think that's really smart. And I think it's smart because, for me, I just have a hard time getting attached to characters in a way where their death means anything to me, right? And the reason why is because, unless I've played them for a while, or unless I've had a really, really good, just like kind of lived in experience with the character, for me, there's a certain level of, there's not a certain level, there's a really high level of abstraction going on, right? And there's a big barrier between like my sort of investment in the character and them just being a bunch of like numbers and details on a piece of paper, right? And so I like it when games have support for like sort of ginning up the emotions that are appropriate for the genre or the setting, right? So horror games are a great example. You know, depending on the horror game, like for the most part, like whenever the carnage starts to happen in a horror game, it just feels like carnage. Like it doesn't feel particularly scary. To me, it doesn't feel particularly meaningful unless there's like some mechanical support for it. So like if you think about Dread, the Jenga tower, that tensioner, right? Like it mimics something, it replicates something, and it brings that emotion to the table to me. It kind of like opens the door for me to kind of step through. And so I love it when games have mechanics that allow you to, that not only support this idea of like, let's enjoy character death, let's experience character death, what does it mean to have your character die? I just think it helps you like kind of cross that bridge that I have, at least with role-playing games, of like get a feeling particularly emotionally invested in a character.
Urban Shadows obviously is a really great example of where all your deaths have meaning. And one of my favorite character deaths was when I killed off my Aware, because she was so lovely and so party unifying that drama stopped happening in the game because everyone just wanted to help Trish. And that was a problem. So I had her die in the game, and the GM and I knew this was going to happen, but nobody else did. And after she died, I don't remember what the Aware's death move is. But I think it's you inspire people or you don't, and they get an extra thing. But we decided to do that in character in a way where they buried her and everyone had a moment to say something about her. And that I decided from that moment if they got something out of like being inspired by the Aware, who did everything to help all of them. And like people were crying, like people had some serious bleed from this character death, and I was like, well, that's cool. Because I had been planning this death for like a couple weeks. But when people started talking about the character and having that funeral, I was like, oh, my feels. Now I feel sad. And I felt guilty for killing my character and making people feel bad. But I really liked the mechanical backing, and I find some of the ones in like Grimworld don't excite me as much because they're mostly just like, here's how it's terrifying when you die and you kill everything, zombie horde. But it makes character death less upsetting because you have something cool that happens.
Right. Yeah. Like you're aiming for it, right? You want that death move to fire off, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes the death moves are a solution to a problem. So even people who aren't really attached to that idea. No, but like, I mean, mechanically, someone might look at it and be like, oh man, this would be an amazing moment for this to happen in the story, and I could solve all my friends' problems with this one thing. Or I could save a certain person, or I could condemn someone else, right? And so even people who are more mechanically minded might look at it and be like, yes, this is a perfectly appropriate moment for this thing that then spins into an emotional experience.
Yeah, if I was the GM and we started having a conversation about, hey, this death move can solve all of our problems, I'm going to go in really hard on making sure that player kind of honors the moment, right? Like, we are going to honor this moment. We're going to show it on screen. We're going to talk about how everyone feels. We're going to have the moment, you know? Actually, I've played Grimworld and we've had situations like, as you just described, like this death move is the one that is going to solve this issue, you know, like, because they're that powerful. They're like nuclear bombs, right? Like they when they go off, like they change everything. And it went like that, you know. It was like, let's make sure this is not just this is not just any ordinary move, right? This is a special thing. This is a big thing.
I think just having it on the sheet also just reminds people to engage in it.
Yeah.
Like if you had a character die, most people would turn to the GM and be like, well, what happens, or how do we deal with, like, they would kind of flounder a bit, I feel like, at least from personal experience. There would be no direction on where to head next. So just having a move that's like, oh, we can fall back to this move, and then it will direct us toward the appropriate scenes.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about setting expectations, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I love about Urban Shadows, a game that I've run a lot, and The Warren, a game I haven't run quite as much, but I've run a fair amount, is because you can essentially choose the manner of your death, or like when your character dies, it puts the conversation on the table, right? Like, it really does. Like, it signals to everybody at the table that this is a theme we're going to explore. This is clearly a theme that's important in this game. And I think anytime you have a justification for having those conversations at the table, and not just with death, with anything, with any theme that the game is trying to explore, it just changes the dynamic completely. Whereas like D&D, I feel like the only dynamic in D&D, and even stuff like Dungeon World, is I just want to keep my character alive so that they can just get better and be badass, right? Like death is like losing, right? Like death is like losing, you know?
Yeah.
Whereas like in other games, like Urban Shadows, like The Warren, like The Watch, death is just, it's a step in the road, it's a process, or maybe it's a celebration, right? It's an important theme of the game.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to note, because there's two games I have in mind that I kind of want to touch on briefly. One being Monsterhearts 1244,
Mm-hmm.
where, if people aren't familiar with that, you play a bunch of people who are going to willingly get burned at the stake
Cathars,
for your
yeah.
religion.
Mhm.
Yeah. And you step down to the game knowing you're all going to die. And it makes death front and center. But at the same time, it's not what the main conversation is about. The main conversation is about, well, why do we so willingly go to our deaths? And what are our relationships like with each other? So it skirts the conversation while also having the conversation in a really compelling way. And the other one I want to briefly touch on that does the exact opposite is Fate of the Norns, Ragnarok, where if your Viking dies, there's this chance for you to essentially advance the game. So you die, and then if people tell cool stories about you, you get an extra rune. And if you did some heroic crap, you get an extra rune. And if you didn't recently desecrate the dead, because that's a no-no in Viking lore, you get an extra rune. And then the Norn, or the GM, pulls a rune. And if your runes match, you unlock a new skill tree for everybody at the table. And you then play your child. So you have a family tree of warriors.
Like that. Yeah.
It's amazing.
It's what made me buy the game.
Yeah, I mean,
I can see why.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I mean, it sounds like a little crunchier than something I normally play, but like, I always love it when the game gives you a cookie for exploring the theme that it wants you to explore, right? Because it just makes your life so much easier as a GM. It really does. You know, like it really, really does.
Yeah. So I liked in Fate of the Norns where it's like, death is a victory. Right, it's going out in style, and it's the same way you do in D&D. You go out in like a burning mass of flames when you fight the dragon, but in this one, it's like, and here's your goddamn reward for it, you motherfucking Viking.
Nice,
right?
nice.
Like, I dig it, and I love when games create that space automatically, and we don't have to try to force it in there. I find D&D, when you're trying to talk about character death, you're kind of like shoving it in there. You're like, we're gonna talk about this. I dig it. Let's force it in.
You're dashing someone's expectations, right? I mean, you really are. Like, you know, if you haven't talked about that up front at the table, someone there is going to resent you, right? Like, someone is going to be like, why are you doing this in my game? You know?
Yeah, well, and they leveled that character up. They spent so much time building this object, right? That's badass. So it feels like a loss. And not an emotional loss in a, like, I lost this game.
Right. Like losing. Yeah, it feels like losing. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I don't think there's really necessarily a way other than to have mechanics that support it to mitigate that, though.
Well, maybe. I mean, I think there's some space for I do think there's some space for having a conversation at the front of the session. I feel like I say this every time we do the roundtable, but like having a conversation in the beginning of every session where you kind of lay out expectations in terms of tone and subject matter. I think that's super important. I do think that, like, if your table is willing to go there and wants to explore, like, you know, the after effects of death, wants to explore what it's like to grieve, I think even if the game doesn't support it, like, you can do things. You can kind of switch things up, move things around to give you more of that experience. I mean, it's ideal if the game does it, right? But like Dungeon World, for example, the last breath move, which is the one that, like, you have to make to determine whether you die or not, as written, it's okay. I don't love it. I basically have sort of like, I kind of invert it to basically make it a sort of storytelling opportunity for the player, you know, to the point where my players like going to the Black Gate. They like doing the last breath roll because they really get to fill in their fiction, you know, in a way that's all about them. And, you know, maybe they die, maybe they don't, but I think there's some room for like a willing and creative table to make those adjustments. But yeah, I agree. As a general matter, it's nice when it's supported in the game.
Any more thoughts on specifically death in games before we kind of talk about grief?
Well, I guess one other angle that we haven't really talked about is, I guess, like, this kind of goes back to our violence conversation a little bit from last time with Avery. But I wonder how much of the sort of emotional payoff of character death, crossing that bridge, like I described earlier, between like the abstraction of numbers on a sheet to actually feeling something for the character. How much of it is just like the amount of time you spend with a character and the amount of buildup that you get to that moment, right? When I run horror games, for example, I always kind of feel like for the deaths of the characters to be significant or meaningful, there has to be a slow build to it, right? Like, I think there has to be like a really, really slow drumbeat build to the possible danger, the possible chance of death, right? I think when you immediately jump in there and start like showing just how like bloody and violent things are, I think you're kind of fucking it up a little bit. If what you're going for is to like have some impact, right, when the character actually dies. And so I guess I don't know what the question is here, except to say, can character death be meaningful when you don't have that buildup or when you don't have much time with a character? Like, is there even a way, you know? Or does that just put that much more pressure on the mechanics of the game to deliver that?
I think if you're looking to get a lot of emotion out of that specific player who loses the character, it's harder. But I think that other people can feel the emotion and you can get the payoff there. Like in one of our games of the watch, we had a brand new player join us, maybe 3 sessions in, lost her character by choice. And it was an epic death scene where they staved off a horde of enemy shadow creatures. And we hadn't really had a chance to really bond with this character, and it felt super sad. Like, here's this person, the potential was wasted, but the player was like, okay, let's make a new character, blah, blah, blah. Like, you know, they didn't feel anything, but we all felt like, we referred to them going forward in future sessions, and like, it was just, you know, so you can get the payoff in other players if not that one.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I never thought about it that way, actually, but yeah.
Yeah, I've seen that in Night Witches as well.
Mm-hmm.
Where you make a character and you go out on your first bombing mission and like you've had a scene or two to bond with this fellow airwoman and she gets blown out of the sky. And everyone else just sits there like someone smacked them and your heart hurts and you're so upset and you know you're going to land and fix your plane and you're not going to have time to grieve for her or say anything, but you're so sad in that moment. But the player's like, oh, well, that sucks. All right, what playbooks are left?
Yeah, now that you mention it, I've witnessed that too in Night Witches, actually. I mean, I suspect it would be the same in the Watch, and I guess, you know, Night Witches is another great example of a game that, to me, because of its structure, it does a lot of the legwork of the emotional buildup, right? I mean, the game is practically an engine for making you care about characters that will then die right away. Right? Like it's almost like what it does.
Yeah.
And it's super clever in that way, right? I mean, I've played Night Witches where characters have died inside of 1 or 2 sessions and it felt really devastating, you know? It's a pretty genius design.
In Night Witches, we had someone die early, an NPC co-pilot. And, you know, people didn't hit them in that moment as hard as other examples. But to underscore that, I had her co-pilot sort of seeing her everywhere. And I kept bringing that up, like, session after session, just in little ways, like to remind her, oh, remember that person who you stopped caring about and thinking about? They're still there. They're still important to you. Like,
it's good.
It's
kind of evil. It's good.
Mean. It was super mean. And I checked with the player and they were like, yes, bring it on. It was great. And it just like reminded them all that they are haunted. And not literally, but figuratively. So even when it doesn't stick, you could find ways to make it stick.
Yeah.
How to Be Evil by Andrew Medeiros.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta be okay
Andrew
with
fucking Medeiros.
But that's right.
That's right. You're gonna have people in the gauntlet saying it now. So this kind of brings me to one quick point I think is important to know is how most of the games we're talking about, and we as people from North America are kind of referring to Western culture in terms of how we handle death in games, and D&D is a very Western culture game and stuff like that, because in Western culture, we're probably the only culture that I know of that actually tries to make our dead look alive.
Oh.
And yeah, we heavily preserve them and we paint them and we do everything we can to make them look alive. And we don't talk about death. They don't die. They have passed on.
Right.
They have left us. They have moved on. We have analogies out the wazoo for what it means to die, but we don't talk about death as a culture very much. Whereas other cultures don't tend to preserve them for very long. They have very very deep mourning and grief and prolonged mourning. We kind of like have the visitation, have the funeral, and you are back to work the next day, mister. I find games are almost mimicking that, where we don't talk about death, but we do definitely like kind of skirt around it a lot in games. And I found it interesting when I was thinking about death in gaming to be like, oh, yeah, we totally embedded Western culture in the way we handle death in games.
That's super interesting.
So
I've never
Very
thought about that angle, but that's super, super interesting. It almost puts the whole idea of like, well, go ahead and roll up another character, like totally in a different light, doesn't it? I mean,
doesn't it?
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, so I found that really interesting. And I found that we also, death in our games, because we talked about the violence thing, are often really, really violent, and they're not usually quiet, intimate, or gentle. And we don't usually talk about suicide, and we don't usually talk about like death because of sustained injuries from abuse. Like we very much are like, the dragon burned you to death, you are crispy, or you exploded and became a god Templar, so now you and that's because you were fighting a ghoul. Or Urban Shadows tends to be really violent. I find when people die, it's not usually like, oh hey, our intimacy moves went off and now I'm poisoning you.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
I mean, I would play that, but I do find our death in gaming is really focused on physically violent, dramatic death. Because I have had a character suicide out. It was probably one of the most upsetting things I've ever done as a player. I was only like 21 at the time, but it stuck with me. It was like a 5-year D&D campaign, and I got painted into a corner. And I was given the decision to become the villain and kill all my friends or suicide out, and I chose to suicide out.
Woof! Wow, I don't.
Wow.
I don't. Gosh, I'm trying to think. I don't think I've ever had a player character, not in recent memory, like kill themselves. That's really.
It's intense, right?
Yeah, it's intense. This is not like some Lines or Veil thing. It's not like, oh, we've been like, your character can't kill yourself. Like, it's just no one's ever gone there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just like a place that no one's ever gone. And I've been in some pretty grim ass games, but for some reason that does feel like a bridge too far, for a lot of people. And maybe it's cultural. I don't know. I suspect there's a lot of social sort of like weirdness and difficulty with making a move like that. I don't think I would feel comfortable at the table, like doing that to my character, because I don't know what kinds of experiences everybody else at the table have been through. Right. And like, that's a hard one to walk back from. Right. Basically, like, I mean, it's, if I get a little dirty, if I get a little sexy and you want to X card that, okay, that's one thing. But like, if I like, just like kill my character, like, I'm not sure the X card is going to like help at that point.
Redeem that.
It's not going to redeem that moment. Yeah, it's really not. So
I've seen it come up in Monsterhearts.
Me too. That's the only place I've seen it.
What was the context, if you don't mind my asking?
Chosen wanted out.
Oh, that's intense. It's still intense though, right? Even with the sort of like, with that like layer of supernatural weirdness, that still seems pretty intense to me.
We X-carded it, actually.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Yep. I think I was the one that X-carded it, to be honest. I have been suicidal, and I didn't trust the player or the GM to handle it in a way that I felt would be
I think that was probably
respectful.
the right move.
Yeah, definitely made the right move.
I was like, if you were a different group of people, we could go there, but you're not, and so that X card. When did you see it, Andrew?
I actually don't remember the specific details, which I feel like I've blocked. Like, it's so awkward.
That's fair.
Yeah, like I don't even want to think about it, but I know it's happening because I have. No, it's fine. Not in that way necessarily. Just like I've chosen to forget it because it's so uncomfortable to think about as a topic. It's just so hard to. We don't talk about it. Yeah.
Kind of going back to this idea of like how like the sort of the weird like pride of place we put on like sudden random violence being the cause of death. I've had loads of player characters and of my own characters essentially commit suicide by just like long-term destroying themselves, right? Like I've had that happen a bunch, like, a sort of spiraling drug addiction, of an addictive, sort of like toxic relationship. Like I've had that happen in games, but never like I am ending it right now. Like that is the thing that's never happened in a game for me. And it's like, it's like, it gives me the chills just thinking about it. Like it just seems like such a, a strong move. But, and it also, in a way, it kind of, I'm discovering right now that it's kind of defeats this earlier point I said before about like feeling like a somewhat detachment from characters, right? Like, but clearly I don't in this way, right? You know, like there's something about that like, you know, pulls it in. So it's interesting. Yeah.
I don't know that there's a solution to talk about like intimate death, because I feel like you can go to that space in The Hour Between Dog and Wolf very well, because there is a killer trying to kill you, and that can become a very intimate moment. But I've never really, other than my one experience where I was like put in a corner, I've never seen people like treat it in a way that they want to go there, which I think is fair, because it's traumatizing. That's upsetting.
Right. Yeah.
So when my character killed herself, we had been playing together for 5 years, and I made a new character, and I joined my previous party, and every character there, except for my character, because she was unaffected, was different after my character had died, because they had witnessed that, and they had been there when she chose to do it, and one of them had handed her the poison that he had been carrying for 3 years. It was this really intense moment, and because of someone's death, they had all changed fundamentally. I don't see that too often, and I loved it, as upsetting as it was, because it was one of the first times I had ever seen grief portrayed in game. Jason, have you run into grief, like actual grieving for a dead person in game?
So here's the thing. So I came back to role-playing games, right? Like I was gone for a long time from role-playing games. I came back like in 2000, like hardcore came back in like 2012 or so, something like that. I was kind of just getting back into this idea of playing with characters, living with characters, like telling stories. Before I was doing board games, total emotional detachment, right? There are no emotional board games that I can think of, right? Except like this sort of like hideous emotion that comes from games like Settlers of Catan or whatever, right? Like where you hate each other. Like that kind of,
Dead of Winter.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, we were doing like lots of like long-term Dungeon World at that time, and this was like mid 2013 or something. And we had a character who had been with us for a long time. Great, really super enjoyable character. And the dice just did their thing, and we lost the character. The character died. It came out of nowhere, you know? Like, we used to, like, laugh and joke, like, in between the games and before games, like, kind of off to the side, like, oh, yeah, TPK, like, da-da-da-da, or, oh, yeah, I remember this one time, like, you know, the GM, we were facing off these storm giants and they killed us all, or whatever, right? Like, it was like, it was almost like just a har thing, you know? Like, oh, yeah, TPK, we all died, da-da-da. But we had this character die, and, like, it came out of nowhere. Like, everybody was just like the mood of the room changed, like everything changed. It was like it was like stunned. It was like we were just stunned. I was a GM. We took a break, and I, you know, I asked the player, I was like, you know, how are you doing? Like, you know, I didn't see that coming, but I felt like that was the honest result, you know, and he was like, no, it's cool. And so we were, you know, kind of talking about it. And so I came back, and I felt super compelled to sort of like funeralize the situation or memorialize the character, right? Like we had like an hour left in the session. And so, I came back, and like, we just had like sharing time. Like we did it in the fiction. Like, you know, we had essentially like a eulogy, you know, type scene where we talked about the character. We sat there after the game was over, and we made some custom moves that allowed us to incorporate the character's like items and stuff into their own magic items and their own, like, you know, to have like tokens of remembrance and things like that. Like it was such a weird, good process. Like I'm glad we kind of like worked through it, but even in games like that, like it can sneak up on you, right? I mean, it really can. And I think that was the first time, like when I say the first time, like the first time since I've been back into role-playing games where that happened. And I was reminded of like, when this hobby is at its best, like when we're doing our best, you know, you can have these kinds of, you can feel these things, right? You can experience these things. But you know, I definitely wouldn't have felt that way about that character dying if it had been session 2, right? Like it just wouldn't have been the same thing. Like this was a character we had for like 10 sessions or something, you know?
Andrew, have you encountered people grieving?
Not as often, I'm afraid. I think that's more to do with people just being uncomfortable with the topic of death. Like, I've definitely seen, you know, those sort of memorial moments and sessions where after a character has died, that we spend some time on that. But not anything long term. The one example that I can think of was in Urban Shadows when I got to be a player. I was playing the Aware, and I was super excited. My first character ever in Urban Shadows, and they were engaged. And I had a conversation with the MC, and I'm like, listen, I'm the Aware. Like, my fiance's not going to survive this campaign. I'm okay with that. And they were like, oh, of course. Like, we had some interesting ideas, and we were just spitballing. And then in the second session, my friend Aaron, who can attest to their randomness at times, they're playing a vampire, and their character went out and died in a sort of terrible fight with the hunter, and then used the power of the new character, who was an oracle, to get my character's fiance to die that session, like immediately following afterwards. And I was just like, no, it's not time yet. Like, even if I was expecting it eventually, we were going to build to it, but it just like, it was so sudden. It wasn't like even that she died, she got turned into a vampire, of course, by the vampire. So she was out there somewhere in the city as this husk, because we had decided that those kinds of vampires aren't people anymore. And so, like, he couldn't even mourn the loss of their love. And so it was like the whole campaign, never knowing what happened to her. It was so painful.
Yeah.
So that's probably the most, that's my big example of grief, I suppose. Grieving for my lost love, who I never got to say goodbye to. All because of Aaron.
Oof.
Yeah.
Good job, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I was really upset at them for doing that to my character.
Yeah, they have a habit, though, of, like, finding that moment and being like, oh, just gonna stab you.
Yeah. Oh, in retrospect, it was brilliantly dramatic, but at the time, I was a little heartbroken.
Yeah.
Good old bleed.
So, yeah, bleed, right?
Yeah. I
find grief is something in gaming more and more I'm interested in seeing, just because I want death to mean something, and I loved when everybody's character changed because my character had died. In both of the big deaths that I've had in the last few years. I had a character in Monsterhearts whose mother was killed by her boyfriend, the Infernal. And there was a funeral scene, and it had fundamentally changed my character to the point where I switched playbooks to The Chosen. And that was her grieving, and there was a lot about her, like, crying in her car and not really showing that she was grieving, but grieving in the background, that I felt really compelled by, and seeing how other people responded to her grief and how other people were grieving in their own way for other things. I felt like Urban Shadows does it too in Monsterhearts, where it provides that space to, like, feel sad. And as a result, you do see people, I find, grieving more when bad things happen to NPCs or PCs. Mm-hmm. But I don't find that space as often in, I would say, fantasy game. Okay, trad fantasy games, because Fall of Magic very much provides the space.
Yeah, it totally does, right? It really does.
But how do you facilitate grief? Like, how do you encourage it? How do you facilitate it? How do you welcome it? Other than a tone conversation at the beginning of the game, Jason.
That's easy. You just bring back visions of their dead friends in following session.
Cry for me now. I don't know if I have any answers here. Like I said earlier, like I do like it when a game like has a sort of built-in mechanic that lets us kind of explore that topic, gives us the freedom to explore it. To some degree, there's like two different levels here, right? Like, are we talking about like the grief we feel as players for the lost character and our sort of lost experience at the table? Or are we talking about like RPing our in-fiction characters and their grief? Like, 'cause I think it's two different things.
You're right. Yeah. I think I'm talking about in-character grief because I have had a lot of grief in my life. I've had people die on me since I was 5, like every 3 years. Yeah. It's been interesting. But as a result, I know for a fact, for me and the people I've talked to, in-character grief and kind of getting that cathartic experience by role-playing out grief is not the same as real-life grief, because there's no out in real-life grief. Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
I actually think that's an easier question. Not easier, but I think it's more actionable. Like, how do we role-play grief, right?
Yeah.
My technique is not too far off from Drew's, of like, just pepper in like, ghosts and memories of this person, reminders. I love a really specific leading question, that evokes a particular line of thinking or emotional response, right? And so here's an example. This is a classic move, like a MC move for me. Rich, we were playing Monster of the Week, and that's a game that I run in a really, really like sort of gonzo mode, right? Like I run that in a really like kind of 80s action horror mode. But he decided he wanted to play a character who, in sort of like classic 80s action hero style, a character whose like wife and son were dead, right? Had been killed, right? And so he's, you know, he was playing the wronged.
The wronged.
Yeah, the wronged.
Yeah.
And so we had a really great scene where we were seeing his apartment for the first time. And I did a type of scene that my players expect like now, where I call it like we're painting the scene. We're coloring the scene. And I asked everybody at the table, I said, I want you each to tell me something you see in this character's apartment that lets you know that he has suffered a loss.
Oh.
Wow.
That's so good.
It was good. I mean, it was probably the best scene of that session. I mean, everybody went around and they were like, everybody was kind of skewing a little bit close to the sort of 80s tropes because that's what I'd asked for, like at the top of the session, but going back to my tone and subject matter stuff. But it was still pretty powerful. Like, there's still the slice of the little boy's 10th birthday cake in the refrigerator, right? Like, we see this picture hanging over here or whatever. Just, it was stuff like that, right? And it was super powerful. I mean, it really, really added an emotional punch to what would have otherwise been a fairly tropey kind of situation, right? And it was grief. I mean, we were displaying loss. That's something I do a lot. That's actually something that's in my personal toolbox.
Andrew, how do you, besides haunting people? I mean, like, what if you're playing a game where there are no ghosts as an option?
There are no ghosts and night witches. But I made it happen. No, I mean, that's just a classic TV trope, right? Where people see those
especially in war.
Lost. Yeah, right. It's just, so even though it's not a real thing, it's just a great cinematic trope. That's a good question. I don't know really how to facilitate grief in an effective way. It's not something I've tackled a lot.
It doesn't come up much. I mean, to be fair,
No.
I mean, I'm going to suggest that like most people, like when they sit down to play a game, they're there to like have a certain degree of like escapism happen, right? And so I think to some degree, we're kind of also talking about like a specific kind of play circumstance, right? And one that I think is really fun, and clearly Kate enjoys it, right? It's a thing that we, that people get into. But I'm going to suggest that like most of the time, even in Gauntlet games, like most of the time, everyone's there to unwind from their long work day, right? And it's kind of like so I think we just don't get much practice, right? It's not something we get tons of practice at. So I think that's totally legit, which might be why it's good to have this conversation, right?
Yeah, I think because I deal with so much grief in my profession, because I talk about grief a lot, not just in terms of like I have lost a person and a person has died, but also you've lost part of yourself. You grieve relationships, you grieve friendships, you grieve when you have children, the person you were, it no longer exists. You'll never be that person again. Something traumatic happens to you, you've lost who you were. That's all grief, right?
Well said.
So I facilitate and hold space for grief a lot. And I think the way I tend to do this in game is when something changes, I ask them specifically how it's changed them. So I ran a 3-year campaign where one of the people they were constantly in contact with, who was an NPC, but everyone had this deep loving affection towards him, even though he was a douche nugget, died protecting them. And afterwards, I said, what is it about him that has changed you? And what is it about his death that has left you different? And it made everyone stop and think and then move forward with a slightly different character, even though it wasn't like a PC who had died. Like it was just an NPC. But asking the question, how are you changed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I like that a lot. I mean, I'm a fan of questions like that. Like, I think I would probably even like, in my games, I would probably even go in like, I would even go in really specific on that. I would be like, what do you see in his pickup truck that lets you know he's changed? Right? Like this is the difference in style, but like I'm with you on that. Like, I think as the MC, that's the main tool you've got, right? Are the questions that you can pose to the players. I'm not sure what other tools you have other than like, I mean, you might be, if you decide to take control of the scene, right? And you really want to paint that scene and really go in on the details for your players. That's a thing you can do. I do that occasionally, not necessarily in a grief context, but I do it in a horror context all the time. I got a little bit of Sarah Richardson in me in that regard, right? Like I love to have a moment every now and then in a scary game where I begin talking really slow like this, and I paint it, I take that moment, I indulge in that moment. I think you can do that with grief too. I don't think I've done that yet. I do tend to rely on the questions. You get more buy-in, I think, when you kind of approach it that way, I think anytime you can get the players to buy into the emotion or the theme of the situation, It's just better.
Agency matters.
Absolutely.
Right. All right, final thoughts?
I'm sad.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic. And we don't talk about it enough.
We don't, yeah. We didn't talk much about, some of the games, that do handle it well, or that at least provide us with the tools. We kind of mentioned a few. Can you guys think of any others that are just really good at if we're going to do an appendix N of grief games?
I think Witch, Road to Lidisfarne.
Yes, that's a good one.
The whole question of the game is, will there be a death or not at the end? Yeah,
that's a good one.
I struggle with that. Amidst Endless Quiet.
I don't know that one.
I think it's called. It's where you are deciding who to save. There are 5 people who could save the world, and you get to decide which one of them is worthy.
Wow.
So you are going to kill 4 of those 5 people.
That sounds
with your decision.
Intense.
Yeah. It's really, really good. It's really upsetting. It's on my list of things I want to do more of, for sure.
I think Warren is really quite good. I mentioned it briefly, but to me, it really, really grabs hold of this idea of death as a storytelling device that you have control over as a player. And I like that. I wish more games did it. I mean, I love the sort of the random and danger aspect of trad fantasy games, but man, I also really like it when you get to have that authorial control over your character's death. I just think that's so cool.
Yeah, I will say Fall of Magic, not because it's specifically trying to do it, but it is about the death of magic, and It is about grieving, and it is about the death of the magus.
It's all about loss.
The last 2/3 of the journey are grief, basically, right? I mean, essentially.
And there's stages to it, but I really like that it takes place in the fall, and it is the fall of magic. And we did play a game recently, a friend and I, where you've already died, and it's your grief journey as you grieve yourself.
Wow.
Yeah, death's been on my mind lately.
No, it's cool.
Hey, Drew. I was going to say, Kate mentioned it, but I think it might be nice for listeners if just explain what the eulogy move is in the watch, what happens during it.
Oh, sure, yeah. So there's a secondary move that, when needed, is there, and it simply states when you give a eulogy for those you've lost. So it's pretty open-ended. You could use it for when you lose a certain person, or if there's been a big conflict and you've lost many, you can sort of say a eulogy over a group if you need to. And it's not super complicated. It's only about 3 lines. It's really simple. If you hit, then basically very simply it says that you honor their memory and that word will spread. People will talk about this and it will continue to be on people's minds as they depart. And, depending on the degrees of success, you can also remove weariness from people. You can actually find peace in those words and sort of honoring those people. So it's simple, but just the fact that it's there kind of punches it a little bit, right? It tells you this is part of the war. People are going to die. You're going to lose people, but you can honor them and you can, do better for them.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, it definitely creates space.
Yeah.
Every time I've seen it used, it's been so upsetting.
Yeah, I've seen it used against their enemies, or they had to put someone down and then decided, well, we need to give this person a eulogy. I'm like, oh wow, that's so powerful. Right? It's just wonderful. Because they're mourning the person that was once a person. It's it was good feels. Yeah, this might be cheating. I haven't played it, but I think Dog Eat Dog might deal with death. If you continue to fight for your tradition and your way of life, you're gonna lose. I think you can go in a blaze of glory.
Yeah, that's right.
Emphasize that.
Oh boy, Dog Eat Dog. That's a game I've run. Maybe I think I played it or run it 4 times, maybe. Each time has been devastating as fuck.
Yeah. So I hear from you.
I want to play it one day.
I've had people literally tell me, I don't think I want to play games with you anymore. After
Whoa.
Dog Eat Dog.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really... because I go in on that game's themes, like those games themes of like power and helplessness and hopelessness and sort of like arbitrary, capricious, authoritarian, like violence and death. Like I go in on it. And yeah, I've had people straight up tell me like, I don't think role-playing games are for me. Like after Dog Eat Dog. I think if you're willing to go there though, it's a good game to explore a lot of those like darker topics.
Yeah. One of these days I'll try that out. Maybe you'll run it for me. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Right? Can you run it?
And then I made my goofy hack of it called Chuck Eat Cheese.
Yes.
Well, thank you for your thoughts on death and grief and being sad with me. Let's go to Giving Me Life.
The happy thing, yes.
Yay.
Mine is super sad.
Of course it is.
This episode of the Gauntlet Podcast is being sponsored by our friends at Nocturnal Media. So listeners, I am personally a big fan of what I like to call horror being done to children. I love the sort of kids on bikes genre of movie and TV show. Think E.T. or Stranger Things. I like anything that kind of explores childhood terror and how children perceive things to be either scarier than they would be in real life or how they sort of overcome like fear, right? I love all that. I think those are great. I myself have written a couple of game-ish sort of things that explore that theme. And so because of that, I'm pretty excited about something that Nocturnal is going to be publishing. It is an English translation of a Spanish game called Innocence. Here's a little blurb. Do you remember the time when any shadow could turn into a monster? Do you remember the strange noises against your window on windy nights? What about when you closed your eyes and hid underneath the bed covers so you couldn't see what was poking through the slightly ajar closet door? Would you like to go back? Would you dare? They are waiting for you, and they are hungry. So I backed this on Kickstarter. It was recently kickstarted. It was a sort of a short frame Kickstarter, only a week. And so we weren't able to tell you about it on the show in time because it was such a short Kickstarter. But it looks like a really, really fun game. I just dig it. I dig this as a theme, like I said. And I think anytime we can see role-playing games that were published in other languages being brought over so that those of us who speak English and only English can experience them, I think that's pretty badass. In fact, Nocturnal does a lot of that. They do a lot of sort of English translations of other games. So if that sounds interesting to you, I'm not sure what the time frame is for when it's going to be more widely available beyond the Kickstarter. I know the text is basically done. The translation's done. I don't think there's much more to do for the game. So I will just direct you to Nocturnal's website and to keep your eyes open for Innocence. I think it's going to be a really neat project. And thanks again to Nocturnal for sponsoring the show.
It's giving me life, even though we're all sad. Good times.
I think sadness and life are pretty much the same.
Wow, that's either
that was dark. Sorry. Life is pain, Kate. Ooh, sorry.
Okay, so Jason, besides pain and life, what's giving you life? I don't. Drew broke me.
The thing giving me life is Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild. That is the Zelda game, the new one. I'm playing it on Wii U. I don't have the Switch, but I have the older system, and they have it for that too. Boy, I love this game. Oh man, like I don't really have time to play video games. Like I just like between Gauntlet, between my professional life, between my personal life with my partner, video games there's just no window, right? But I am finding time to play Breath of the Wild. It is so good. I think that if I'd have to just say really quickly, like the one thing I really love about it, the game feels you feel completely unshackled in this game. It feels like you can go and see and do anything in this incredibly vast world. Like it feels truly, truly open world. It feels big. It seems filled with mystery and meaning. It's quiet. It's got this like just beautiful quietude to it. Like you get absorbed in the game's just like basic calmness and quiet to the point.
It sounds like Fall of Magic.
Yeah, it kind of is actually. Like it just feels like every moment, like every little nook that you find, every little moment that you engage in, it just feels like a little beautiful quiet thing that you get to enjoy. And it's interspersed here and there with like little fights and stuff. But for the most part, it's just you on your horse, Nutmilk. That's what I named mine.
Nice.
I have chocolate and nut milk. Those are my two.
So cute.
Those are my horses. I have a third horse, but I haven't named them yet. It's just you on your horse, and you're just, going across the landscape. You get off, climb a mountain, go down a hole, come back up, cook some food. There's a lot of cooking. I don't know. It's just great. I love it. Breath of the Wild. It just feels like wonderful childlike video game stuff. I just really love it.
Amazing. I had a client spend 90 minutes in a massage today telling me about
it. It's everything. I love it. I live for it.
Seems really cool. I wish I had a console, but I refuse.
Me too. Well, I don't. I just don't have that console. Andrew, giving you life.
What's giving me life? So I thought about this, and it's been a while since I've been on the Gauntlet, and this is all kind of comes full circle. So I've been playing a lot of Imperial Assault lately, which is the Star Wars miniature game.
We haven't had Star Wars talk on the Gauntlet podcast in ages.
Well, speaking of
it's been a long time.
There's nothing worth talking about.
Well, I actually heard about this game through Steve Main.
That's right. Okay, yeah, this is all coming together now. All right, cool.
Who always just talked about it a couple years ago, and so I was like, "What is this game? Sounds really interesting." And now I'm obsessed with it, and it's all Steve's fault. To the point where after I played it for the first time, I messaged him, and I'm like, "Steve, this game's amazing, but I'm doing it all wrong." And he started coaching me and giving me some ideas, and so the Gauntlet is the reason I played this game, and I'm still loving it. And I've been painting minis again, which I haven't done in years.
Awesome.
Just having a great time with it. So.
Little bonus factoid. This is probably the last episode that Steve is going to edit because he's moving on to other things.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and so it's nice that he's got this little bit to look forward to. So
I hope he enjoys it because he's earned it. I kind of owe him a debt for giving me something to enjoy.
Nice.
That's awesome. So my giving me life is also sad. A while ago, people kept recommending to me that I watch Spartacus. And I've become obsessed with it. It is like the thing I watch whenever I'm sad. It's so good. And recently on Netflix, they released a movie called Be Here Now, which is the story of the man who played Spartacus, Andy Whitfield's journey through non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and eventually death. It follows his wife Vashti and her journey, and you bear witness to all the moments, like when he's getting radiation to his stomach and it's painful, and when he's told there's no more treatment options and he realizes in that moment he is going to die, and you follow him through all of those really intimate moments. And at the end of it, she talks about how he told the story to his son, about how whenever he looks up he will be in the clouds, and then the little boy leaves and Vashti goes in and he holds her hand and says, "I love you," and he dies.
Wow.
And that's her final moments with him. And he was a big yogi, and his favorite part of yoga meditation was the phrase, "Be here now," which is why the documentary is called Be Here Now. And it's the idea that blessed are those who are present in the moment. And I'm not a big yogi. It's not my thing. But there are parts of that teaching that are really, really beautiful. And I found the idea that he was so present and so graceful and so loving, even through his journey. And towards the end, where he was just like, remember to be here now, like to just be present in the moment that you're living in. Really inspiring. And it's something I've been trying to practice, and because I have a habit of wandering off in my thoughts. And now I'm just trying to be very present with everyone around me so that I'm fully with them. And that's giving me life.
That's great.
Yeah.
If you feel like crying, go watch the documentary. It's super upsetting.
Or just rewind this episode, listeners.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Andrew fucking Medeiros. I'm very touched that you came and podcasted with me.
It's a real pleasure. I love the Gauntlet, and I'm always happy to be on.
Jason, thanks again for joining us
here.
Yeah,
thanks for doing it. You're doing a wonderful job hosting these roundtables.
Absolutely.
Oh, thanks. I'm trying, even with a head cold. Listeners, I want to thank everyone for joining us for this episode. It's been intense and lovely and horrible and wonderful. And I hope you'll join us again for the next one. What is giving you bleed lately, friends of mine?
Who would you like to go first?
Well, technically, it's supposed to be you, Jason, but you have this nice blank space in there.
I
like
know,
always.
I never fill it out. I know. Okay. Giving Me Bleed. My last two Giving Me Bleeds were